Good morning, students. It is the rat trap. It is the second video in this connection, and I would tell you the line by line explanations that the story continues with. It is the rat trap. Once upon a time, there was a man who went around selling small rat traps of wire. He made them himself at odd moments from the material he got by begging in the stores or at the big farms. But even so, the business was not especially profitable. So he had to resort to both begging and petty thievery, small stealings, to keep his body and soul together. Even so, his clothes were torn, his cheeks were sunken, and hunger gleamed in his eyes. Really, he could not eat both times meal. He was so poor. No one can imagine how sad and monotonous his life was. He was a completely vagabond who plods when walks along the road, left to his own meditations. But one day this man had fallen into a little line of thought which really seemed to him that it was entertaining him. He had naturally been thinking of his rat traps when suddenly he was struck by the idea that the whole world about him is nothing but a big rat trap. So now what did happen? You will understand. It offered him riches and joy, shelter and food, heat and clothing, exactly as a rat trap offered cheese and pork. And as soon as anyone let himself be tempted to touch the bait, it closed in on him, and in everything came to an end. So it was the condition. As soon as the rat sees a pork or cheese and just tries to get it, his life comes to an end. It is with the human beings that one cannot avoid. It is all. The world had, of course, never been very kind to him, so it gave him unwanted joy to think ill of it in this way. It became a cherished pastime of his during many dreary ploddings to think of people he knew who had let themselves be caught in the dangerous snare trap, and of others who were still circling around the bed. It was the bed. One dark evening, as he was trudging, walking along the road, he caught sight of a little grey cottage by the roadside and knocked on the door. He knocked on the door to ask shelter for the night. He was not refused. He was allowed to stay in because he had no one, and he wanted him to stay because he had no wife, no child. He served him porridge, and he cooked the supper and served him. He gave him a big slice from his tobacco roll that it was enough both for the stranger's pipe and his own. Finally, he got out an old pack of cards and played marvelous with his guest until bedtime. The old man was just as generous with his confidences as with his porridge and tobacco. The guest was informed at once that in his days of prosperity his host had been a crofter at Ramsjo Iron Works and had worked on the land. Now that he was no longer able to do, deliver. It was his cow. It was his cow that was really providing him money because it was extraordinary bossy, gave him milk for the creamery every day, and last month he had received all of 30 kroner in payment. The stranger must have seemed incredulous, for the old man got up and went to the window, took down a leather pouch which hung on a nail in the very window frame, and picked out three wrinkled 10 kroner bills. These he held up before the eyes of his guest, nodding knowingly. So here it was this very man who had come to see everything. Then he stuffed them back into the pouch. The next day, both men got up in good season. The crofter was in a hurry to milk his cow, and the other man probably thought he should not stay in bed as the master had got up. So both of them took their ways. After half an hour, the rat-trap peddler stood again before the door. He did not try to get in. However, he only went up to the window, smashed the window pane, and stuck his hand, got hold of the pouch with the 30 kroner, and then he thrust the money in his pocket and went away, and he thought that he would not move towards the main highway, rather he should go into the other way, subway, and he realized, of course, that at first he dared not continue on the public highway but must turn on the road into the woods. During the first hours, this caused him no difficulty. Later in the day, it became worse, for it was a big confusing forest which he had gotten into. He tried to be sure to walk in a definite direction, but it was difficult to walk. Evening fell and it started drizzling. He was really thoughtful that whatever he had thought that he would get out of it, he could not, and he was stuck in the thickets and fallen logs closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison from which he could never escape. It was late in December. Darkness was already descending over the forest, and this increased the danger and increased also his gloom and despair. Finally, he saw no way out, and he sank down on the ground, tired to death, thinking that his last moment of life had come. But just as he laid his head on the ground, he heard a sound. A hard, regular thumping sound was there. There was no doubt as to what that was. He raised himself. Those are the hammer strokes from an iron mill. He thought there must be people nearby. He summoned all his strength, got up and staggered in the direction of the sound. When he moved in that direction, the Ramshaw ironworks, which was now closed then, were not so long ago a large plant. A large plant it was, and it was so long. It was with a smelter, rolling mill, and forge. In the summertime, long lines of heavily loaded barges and scows slid down the canal, which led to a large inland lake, and in the winter time the roads near the mill were completely black from all the coal dust which sifted down from the big charcoal crates. So it was During one of the long dark evenings just before Christmas, the master smith and his helper sat in the dark house near the furnace, waiting for the pig iron which had been put in the fire to be ready to put on the anvil. So here it was the condition that he had to wait. It was glowing mass with a long iron bar returning in a few moments, dripping with perspiration, though, as was his custom, he wore nothing but a long shirt and a pair of wooden shoes. All the time there had been sounds to be heard. The big bellows groaned, and the burning coal cracked. The fireboy shoveled charcoal into the maw of the furnace with a great deal of clatter. Outside roared the waterfall, and a sharp north wind started to blow with the rain, and it sounded on the brick tiled roof. It was probably all this noise that the blacksmith could not hear a man opening the gate who had entered the floors until he stood close up to the furnace. Surely it was nothing unusual for this poor vagabond without any better shelter for the night. And so he had come, and he saw that there were sooty pens, and to come in to warm themselves in front of this. The blacksmith glanced only casually and indifferently at the intruder. Who was the intruder? The rat trap. He looked the way people of his type that usually did. He was having a long beard, dirty ragged, and with a bunch of rat traps dangling on his chest. He asked permission to stay, and Master Blacksmith nodded a hearty consent without honoring him with a single word. The tramp did not speak a single word. He had not come there to talk, but he had come here for feeling warm and sleep. In those days, the Ramsey Iron Mill was owned by a very prominent iron master whose greatest ambition was to ship out good iron to the market. And he watched both night and day to see that the work was done well, as possible as it could be, and so that he always had a nightly rounds of inspection. Naturally, the first thing he saw was all that tall ragamuffin, means covered in rags, who had eased his way to so close to the furnace that steam rose from his wet rags. The ironmaster did not follow the example of the blacksmiths, who had hardly deigned to look at the stranger. He walked close up to him, looked him over very carefully, and then tore off his slouch hat to get a better view of his face. But of course, it is you, he said. Nils Olof. He could have an old recognition, and he thought that he was working with him in the regiment, and he said that why yes, it was his regimental comrade, and why he had to leave the job, and it was his condition that he had to become a vagabond and trying to search for food and shelter. Really, it was the most pathetic scene that he had seen. Thank you, Chakra. I will tell you something more in the next video that you will know much better. And so I end this video. Thank you again.